Go. Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul and Strategy, and this is Tosca. And this is, as I just said to Michael, my guest, our first recording of 2025. In recent years, we've been reading once again what happens when nonprofits or other social purpose organizations suddenly receive a big unrestricted gift. Often, but not always, from a high wealth individual donor. A gift that truly makes the organization grow exponentially. In a context of rising extreme inequality across the world and the emergence of a class of hyper wealthy people, this is more likely to happen. And we know such people can have tremendous influence on charities, as well as on matters of national economics, politics, and society. You would think that it's every ED's wish to receive a big transformational gift. But how do we prepare our organizations? And are there any traps or downsides that we should be aware of as leaders? Are there any unintentional negative consequences one should also consider and prepare for as leadership or as board? As it happens, I have a colleague, a consultant who has looked into this. Michael Randel of Randel Change Associates, or RCA. Michael was on my show in 2024 talking about change management. That is episode number 8080. We'll link to it in the show notes. In this episode, we're going to discuss what he learned when he researched how social impact organizations should manage receiving a transformational gift. And he wrote a brief about it called Making the Most of a Windfall, Navigating the Early Months of a Transformational Gift. And that brief we will link to in the show notes, of course. I do want to make a note to our listeners that yes, in the US context, the MacKenzie Scott big unrestricted gifts prompted this type of research. Scott is the co-founder of Amazon and the former wife of Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, and one of the richest people in the world. Please note that we are not going to focus solely in this conversation on the specific circumstances and features of the MacKenzie Scott giving, since that is generally limited to an American context. There are plenty of other countries where, due to rising inequality, large-scale philanthropic giving has grown and big transformational gifts are given. So in this episode, we're going to focus on that management, leadership, and change management response to such big gifts. So with that, welcome, Michael.
Hello, Tosca. It's nice to see you again.
It is very good to see you again, indeed. As I said, Michael is the owner of Randel Consulting Associates, which offers change management consulting services to social purpose organizations in the nonprofit, public sector, and private sector spheres, also in multilaterals, for instance. He's a former change consultant at the World Bank. He has worked for a Danish development agency in Southeast Asia, and he started out as an organizational development practitioner in South Africa, his home country, including a phase during which Michael worked for the South African youth organization YMCA right during South Africa's apartheid struggle. Michael, let's start with the basics. Mm-hmm. Particularly for those of us who have not yet listened to your previous episode, number 80 of last year, 2024, how is Randel Change Associates supporting its clients, and what kind of clients do you serve?
Well, let's jump right in with that. So what we're really focused on is working with leaders and their teams that are going through change. And for many of our clients, the change they're encountering is about growth, scaling, dealing with growing capacity, growing budgets, more staff, greater opportunities. And what we discover is not surprising, that the systems, the processes, the structures that you have for managing your organization at a certain size don't work when the organization expands. And many organizations get into problems because they keep trying to use the old structure and the old processes even while they've already expanded. So what we do is we work with them to help them sort of to right size is an expression that people use, kind of to get better alignment between those sorts of things. And particularly we pay attention to the people dynamics. So helping leaders, which may be either existing leaders or newly promoted leaders, to step into a bigger setting, a bigger context, helping teams to take stock of new members or of an expanded mandate. And so we typically provide 3 sets of services that are complementary to each other. We work with individuals, which is often through coaching. We run group programs. So think of learning programs for a cohort of leaders studying together to build their capacity. And then we work with teams. And we see the team as the real vehicle of change in an organization. Yeah. So we might work with a senior team or an executive team, and then from there cascade and work with other teams across the organization.
Okay, that's good. And of course, we could have a whole discussion about whether growing is always the an appropriate objective at all, and things like degrowth, and what, especially for global North nonprofits, global North founded nonprofits, etc. But we're not going to go there today.
I would love, because I have opinions, but yes, let's not go there.
Okay, well, who knows? There will be a part 3 to this conversation sometime. But let's get into this one, part 2 now. So what motivated you, Michael, to look into how nonprofits should prepare for receiving big transformational gifts, resulting in the brief that you wrote?
Yeah. Well, it started in, I would say, 2020, which is, I think, when MacKenzie Scott first began to make the news. I had no idea who she was at the time. But she was making large and unexpected size of gifts, so they were quite large, to unusual places. So I remember a colleague telling me about this, and she was following it, and she said, oh, she's giving a lot of money to rural organizations, to health centers, to universities, tertiary institutions in more rural serving areas. Focusing on organizations run by and for women, for example. So I thought that's really intriguing, because so many philanthropies go to the big urban centers, to the familiar, well-known organizations. So I thought, something different about this. Fast forward a year or two, and several organizations that I had previously consulted with began to receive these gifts. And because I knew the organizations and some of their internal dynamics, I was really curious about what's the impact. For example, in one real case, $10 million lands in the bank account one morning. And the financial director calls the CEO to say, something really strange has just happened. There's $10 million that wasn't there yesterday. What's going on?
Wow.
So yeah, so this happened to several of my clients. And so I thought, I wonder what's going on. I had a hypothesis that I wanted to test. So I began talking and interviewing these leaders. And over the next few months, I spoke to probably close to leaders from 30 organizations.
Okay.
They had received probably $250, $300 million from these different organizations. And I'm really happy to say that my starting hypothesis was proven to be wrong.
Which was?
I got a much better understanding at the end of it.
Okay.
So my starting hypothesis was, in a sense, the saying, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Right? Many leaders want to have the resources to grow and strengthen their organizations. And they imagine that a gift that comes with no strings attached, which is what MacKenzie Scott was doing, will be the magical solution. My hypothesis was that the impact of a whole bunch of money arriving is actually going to be very divisive.
Divisive.
Divisive. It's going to cause conflict, because most leadership teams are not really teams. They're a collection of interest groups.
Correct.
people come together and they will advocate for, we need to do invest in this program or invest in that region, or, you know, I need it more than you need it. And so that's what I was anticipating might be going on. And so I was pleasantly happy to discover I was completely wrong. That in the vast majority of cases that I spoke to, the money actually landed without causing division, without causing conflict and strife, and was really well used to fuel strategic growth and expansion.
Okay, I think we're going to unpack what that could look like, and still whether there might be some potential traps to look out for, etc., even if they were not of the kind so much that you initially expected. And I could have myself also potentially have hypothesized around that. So let's dive into that topic a bit more, and how to manage a lead through receiving such a big gift. So to give our listeners first a sense of scale of such gifts in proportion to the organization's current size and capacity. So in a recent separate study of MacKenzie Scott gifts that I know you're also familiar with, to give you an example, the minimum gift that was given was one for $500,000 for an organization with, at that time, an operating budget of $10,000 before the gift, and a full-time staff of 1. A median level gift was for $5.5 million that went to an organization with an operating budget of previously $6.5 million, so almost a doubling, right? And a staff of 48 at that time. And a maximum level gift at the time of the study of $80 million going to an organization with a previous operating budget of $450 million. So that's a less big proportion, and a staff of 10,000. So overall, substantial gifts in proportion to the size of the organization and the scope of its program at that time, right? So, Michael, if that's the case, let's first go to, you have on your website a useful, what shall I call it? A short kind of overview of what to do when you receive that big transformational gift, right? And so for our listeners, let me unpack the 4 or 5 things that you mentioned. 1 is engage a trusted advisor for the CEO. 2, consider how to share this news, which I was interested in. 3, establish, of course, how you will invest in priorities. 4, a working group to run the process. And 5, managing ongoing communications. I'd love for you to unpack each of those dimensions a little bit, if you could.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I discovered is when you read an announcement in the media or in social post saying such and such organization received a gift, you should know that they actually didn't just receive the gift, that they may have had it for 6 months or even longer. But they've been quiet about it. Okay. And they've now made their public announcement when they're ready to do so. Okay. Yieldgiving.com is the website that is now set up to sort of manage communications about these MacKenzie Scott gifts. It's her own website. It's where she has her essays about why she's doing what she does and so on. Okay. And there's a database there of the 2,500 organizations that have received gifts from her over the last 4 or 5 years. And quite a few of them have chosen to not disclose the amount of money that they received. Right. So what is now public is the fact that, yes, these organizations did receive a gift, but not necessarily how much. And that's by the choice of the organization. Yeah. Right. So there's a number of reasons why you don't want to announce the gift as soon as it lands in your bank account. Right. For many organizations, they did not know the gift was coming. It was literally a complete surprise. Yeah. Some of the organizations, they'd been approached by a firm that was doing vetting. They had signed a non-disclosure. They had provided certain financial and program strategy information. So they knew they were being vetted by somebody for something, They didn't know for sure if it was MacKenzie Scott gift or not. And they had no idea how much might come, when it might come, right? Because the purpose of vetting is to say, actually, some are worthwhile and others don't meet the standard.
Yeah.
But just because you've been approached doesn't mean that you're
Right.
certain of getting some funding.
Yeah.
So assuming that you've got this unexpected, let's just say $10 million, or the median, as you said, $4 or $5 million, you weren't expecting that, right? So if you immediately post an announcement about it, it's going to start all sorts of speculation and all sorts of, I'm going to use a polite word, maneuvering.
Yeah, jockeying.
Right? Lobbying, jockeying, right? You're sort of creating a set of dynamics that you actually don't want to have.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be under pressure and in the public spotlight while trying to decide how to best use these resources. So that's why wisely, many organizations keep it on the quiet, right? And so that comes into my sort of really first two tips. Have an advisor for the CEO from outside of the organization, because the CEO is going to have a big influence on, how this process is going to be managed. So you want somebody who's not on staff, not another senior leader, but somebody who's independent, who can be of counsel to the CEO.
So it's the independence that is in this case you're particularly stressing.
I think that's really important
because of that dynamic potential of jockeying, speculation, etc. Okay.
Right. That's right. And if you find the right person, they will have no vested interest. They themselves will not be somebody who's going to benefit from this gift.
Yeah.
They're trying to support and advise the CEO.
Right.
And then the second piece from that is work out how you're going to start to tell people about this news, even if it's not public. How are you going to let the board know? How are you going to share this with senior leaders? When will you share it with staff, right? These are not necessarily just one communication to everybody at once.
Right.
There's all sorts of different reasons for approaching different people in a different order. Again, what you're wanting to do at this kind of quiet phase is to build support for the process you intend to follow to work out strategically how to allocate these resources. Right?
Okay.
So then, the next kind of two pieces are then, so what do we do? So you got to work out how we're going to invest in this, and who's going to be running the process of that sort of decision process. And again, there's many different things that people did. So there's,
Yeah.
there isn't even a simple menu like here's 5 things you can consider. There's many things.
Yeah.
But what I think actually works really well is when you assemble a cross-organizational working group and give them the charge of doing an assessment and coming up with options and even recommendations that ultimately may be the decision of the CEO and the board, or perhaps the CEO and the senior leadership team, depending on, organizational governance. But it's helpful to keep the CEO and even senior leaders out of the baking of the pie, if you will.
And that is because
they themselves will have interests, right? And have a lot of influence.
Yeah.
And so you really want to kind of try and step back and say, what's best for the organization and its mission and its strategies? So by having this kind of sample representative group of staff involved, they're kind of canvassing, they're doing consultations, they're weighing up the pros and cons of different options, and then can bring a sort of a set of recommendations or options for leadership from which to take a decision.
Okay.
So that also has other side benefits. I mean, one is it begins to build more buy-in across the organization for the final decision, right?
Yeah.
You're able to address early on, perhaps, an issue like, oh, fantastic, they've got all this money. We're all going to get salary raises. We're going to get bonuses. We're going to be going on a hiring spree. And to be able to say, let's not, those are criteria that are off the table, right? one leader said to me that they would not raise salaries because this is not a sustaining source of revenue. And they don't want to pay salaries out of non-sustainable thing.
Although I do remember, but again, these are all probably what I'm now referencing is a case of one or two maybe, but where some people did invest in the overall what they call the staff climate. So which I imagine, given the level of pay and workloads, etc., did include better salaries or benefits or working conditions, so that because they felt that that was important for the culture. And I'm not at all myself inclined to critique that.
No, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not saying you should not
right.
salary increases, but many organizations chose not to because it wasn't a sustainable revenue source to be able to make sure that they can continue to pay higher salaries into the future.
Can we jump a little bit towards that? What I read, the financial cliff. So what to do when, depending on how the money is spent and or also invested in endowments, etc., investment policies, etc. But that financial cliff that is may be coming, and it may be a very steep one, depending on how the organization acts. Right? Were you able to collect data on that?
Well, not so much particular data on the current financial cliffs, because there seem to be a series of them. But one of the leaders I spoke with early on, her approach to this money was guided by the experience of having previously faced a financial cliff. So this was, I think, from the 2008, 2009 kind of financial crisis. But her organization had a large gift before that, which they had used to expand.
Yeah.
Hire more staff, open more locations. When that financial cliff hit them, they had to contract. And she found it the most painful experience, laying people off, closing down offices and things like that.
Yeah.
So she was determined when they got the MacKenzie Scott money to avoid the same trap.
Right.
Right. So you may well grow and expand, but it'll be much more strategic. And you'll be looking to bring in sustaining funds to support what you might use as, let me call, startup funding, or using the gift to get something going. But you want to make sure you've got a way to sustain it beyond the initial startup costs.
Yeah, I found it quite interesting to read about. You also have to manage as an organization how your other donors, how they respond, right? So some feared, and in some cases it happened, but in other cases not, that other donors, other high wealth individuals or institutional donors kind of pulled back from their commitment because they felt you guys don't need it. But for others, it was actually a mark of reputation that helped them develop more resources. Anything in your own research on that you could point to?
Certainly, this was a major concern for many of the leaders, right? I mean, you gave some examples of an organization getting a gift equivalent to their annual budget.
Yeah.
Even if it's $10 million or $50 million, there's a couple of cases I'm familiar with, it's not actually that much money, right? If you lose other sources of revenue, this $10 million can get used up really quickly on operating costs, and you're not able to use it as sort of investment and innovation funding. So this is part of the kind of this quiet phase. Some of the kind of consultations and engagement is going to your other supporters, major supporters, and saying, look, we've got this gift. Here's how we're intending to make use of it, right? This is why we still rely on and desire your continued support. Because if you keep supporting what you have been supporting, we can use these new funds for new purposes, as opposed to having to use them into backfill. So it's all about stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management.
Got it. Yes, exactly. In fact, for a moment, it made me think of something similar, out of somewhat similar motives. nonprofits have to do when they are considering a merger or an acquisition, either being merged with or acquired, or merging or acquiring, that to go to their main donors and early on in a quiet kind of way and say, we're thinking about this, to basically seek their input, seek their buy-in, sometimes, of course, also ask for kind of funding to fund that marriage kind of proposal, if you will, because there are significant due diligence costs and others involved, but also to manage those donors' expectations and feelings.
Right.
It feels a little bit similar to, but with a different motive, of course. That's very interesting. Yeah. You have written something else, again, a learning brief available on your website, and we'll link to it. The Prepared Organization, Are You Ready for Growth? And tell us a little bit, you talk about your organization, people and process will be tested like never before. If growth hits you, do you actually have a proven approach? Is your leadership aligned? Will your culture support growth? And can you flex, adapt, and innovate? And before we started recording, you said something interesting about prepared for growth and getting these big grants or big gifts. Tell us about that.
So this is a great story. One of the leaders that I interviewed had received their funding. I think this was 2022. And so at that point, there had been sort of 3 years of these very high profile gifts being made by MacKenzie Scott. So his organization had been saying, you know, some of our peers are getting it. Some of our competitors, organizations like us, are getting money. I wonder when it's going to be our turn. Right. And I think many organizations have had that sort of, ooh, I wonder if we're going to be considered. Right. But they didn't stop there. They then said to themselves, you know, would we be ready if we did get funding? Would we be prepared? And they took an honest look at themselves and realized that they were actually not ready to receive a large gift and to be able to make best use of it. So I thought that was so interesting that this actually became the kind of the heart of this frame that I subsequently developed. Because when I then went back and looked at the organizations I've been interviewing, and I looked at more organizations as I move forward, what I identified in many of them, not all, because we're humans, but in many of them, they had actually done their cleaning up work, if you will, before they got a gift.
And what is that about, their cleaning work?
Well, so think of it partly this way, right? This is not something you are putting in a proposal for. So you can't time it, you can't expect it. So it's not like you've got an inspection coming, you want to make things nice and clean.
No.
Right. But this is about very often sparked by a new incoming leader, but not always, right? Who comes in and maybe they're kind of coming into a situation where there's a bit of a turnaround needed.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's an organization that's gotten a bit complacent. And so the new leader wants to kind of refresh and reinvigorate and re-energize.
Yeah.
Right? To kind of help the organization be the best that it can be. Right. And so there's a number of things that they were doing, and I saw this across the board, that were about, to use an English expression, you know, getting things shipshape, which is a sort of a naval expression from the old days of sailing ships. You get all the ropes tied properly and the sails folded properly, so you're ready to use them when you need them.
Okay.
And so that's what they were doing. They were getting things ready so that when they were called on, they could just go ahead, pick it up and use it right away. As opposed to trying to find it and untangle the knots and discover it's expired. You know, get it all ready in advance so that when something happens, you're ready for it.
So one of your elements was, will your culture support growth? Talk to me about that. What does that look like? How do you know, and how do you make it ready?
Right, it's such an interesting one. There's a phrase that is quite well known in management circles. Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
It's attributed to the management thinker Peter Drucker. And it's the idea that you can have the best informed strategy, but your culture is actually more enduring.
Mhm.
And the culture will continue and will subsume any big ideas
And will also outlive
and outlive them.
generations of leaders at
Exactly.
times. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of anecdotal truth in that expression. I think many leaders recognize it, right? And so when we're talking about workplace culture, we're wanting to make sure that when you have either new ideas or you've clarified strategies, right? Because sometimes that can mean letting go of things you've done in the past
Mm-hmm.
to focus either on certain core things or to introduce certain new things.
Yeah.
You want to be then have, as part of that whole process, engagement of staff around why are we making these necessary changes? To be realistic and humane about how that impacts on staff,
Mm.
right? To look at the behaviors that are needed to support the ways of working that are required to carry out your strategy. So, it's not just about let's clarify, our vision and mission and let's have a strategy. Those elements are helpful. I'm not going to say they're essential. I'll say they're helpful.
Mm.
But if you don't also pay attention to workplace culture, quality and capabilities of management,
Mm-hmm.
of your people processes, of your financial systems, of your IT systems,
Yeah.
all of those things can frustrate you and prevent you from being able to accomplish the most noble, the most important, the most worthwhile strategy. So when I kind of talk about identified 6 things, they are things about, purpose, focus, strategy, having a sort of a theory of change or a signature system that is proven, that is evidence-based. So those
Yeah.
are all important, along with alignment of leadership, right? Everybody's working towards the same set of
Yeah.
goals.
That hard to achieve, but essential.
Right.
Yeah.
Capable people, the appropriate systems and processes, the culture, the ability to also reflect and review and take stock of new developments and maybe adapt and change accordingly.
Mm.
So it's not just about what's our position paper on our strategy, but how are we going to be able to carry this out? Yeah, and then sometimes, I was going to say, how do we carry that out with the people that we have? But actually, there's a really interesting case study of an
Mm-hmm.
organization that realized where it needed to go strategically to make an impact, their current operating model and their current staff were not a fit. And they
Right.
had to let go probably more than 80% of staff
Wow.
to be able to really go into the new direction that strategically they saw long-term potential.
That's quite that sounds like and I mean this in a neutral way, but that's like an outlier that high of a percentage.
Right.
Before we started recording, you also said that you've collected some data on not just on the you, you are aware also through your client work, not just of MacKenzie Scott gifts in the American setting, but also some other settings. Are there things from those cases that you can speak to as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of these kinds of prizes, they're sometimes called.
Mm-hmm.
Big bets,
Yes.
innovation funding. So yes, there's a variety of opportunities globally, either within the country, across a region, or even globally, where you can put in a bid to get some funding to back a big idea.
Yes.
Again, the saying, careful what you wish for, is present. Again, it can be very helpful, obviously, to get new funding to be able to launch new something or to test an experiment, a pilot of some form.
Right.
But
Maybe,
just because you have the idea doesn't mean you're going to be able to carry it out.
right. Yeah. Maybe can you give an example of where, so even though your hypothesis, again, which I could definitely have imagined myself coming up with, did not fully come out, that it didn't lead to a lot of division, etc. Have you seen, either through your client work or through the research you did, examples where there were some real negative impacts, not just positive ones, from sudden growth of this nature?
Yeah. Um, I don't think I directly saw sort of negative benefits from sudden growth. What I was more aware of, what was alerted to, was no impact because of poor management of the gift.
Okay.
Right. So kind of one example was
Wasted impact, if you will.
wasted. I mean, so there was
Mm.
an organization that got several $1 million. It had gone to the CEO, who was a very kind of secretive person. And he then left the organization, and they discovered there was this sum of money, and they didn't know how long it had been there. They didn't quite know what to do with it.
Mm.
So they thought they might use some of it for staff development.
Yeah.
So get nice, yes, good. But really, if you get several $1 million and you don't know what to do with it, to
Yeah.
me, that was pointing to there was something going on in that organization that wasn't healthy.
And that they certainly weren't prepared for growth.
Not certainly not. You know, another different example that I heard of, a leader treated the funds as their personal, their not funds for themselves personally. I don't want to say there was any corruption or anything like that, but they themselves would decide, and they alone would decide how to dole out the money.
Yeah,
So kind of people began playing favorites with this leader, hoping to attract their attention.
of
But
course.
again, it wasn't strategic.
Yes.
Or it's like, let's just give an equal amount to everybody or to each
Yes.
program. Again, that's not strategic. So
Yes.
yes, it helps fund work, but it
Yes.
doesn't necessarily um, advance impact,
Right.
which for me
Right.
is much more important than simply growth or size.
Yeah.
What's the
Yeah.
difference we can make?
I want to return one more time to an element. We talked a bit about culture, and we talked about some aspect of change management, something that you and I really care about. Um, and I'm just going to read a quote from a recipient organization where they said, this meant not only an influx of funds, but also an influx of people, new people who needed to be brought on board to help strategically make use of this big transformational gift. And those new people can create culture shocks in an organizations. Some recipient organizations saw their culture shift as they scaled. Some longtime staff felt displaced and feared the original mission-driven ethos was lost on new staff. And rapid growth also sometimes led to burnout.
Yes,
Anything you want to comment on those dynamics? They spoke to me.
they do. Well, so the burnout piece, is I was talking with one client this morning. Um, Getting ready for growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the stuff about either whether you're getting prepared, or you've just got the funding and you're trying to work out what to do with it, setting things up to grow, all happens on top of the existing work. And
Yes.
that's what you have to do before you can hire the extra people to do all these things. So there is a real challenge of additional work being required of people once this comes in, and so you risk stress and burnout. But there's another dynamic which can be really harmful for organizations, which is the money is being used for what I'm going to call shiny new projects.
Mm-hmm.
So new people are hired to work on these shiny new projects. And because they're shiny and new, they get a lot more media attention, board attention, senior leadership attention.
Mm.
And it can bring about jealousy.
Yes.
right? Because all the folk who've been there during the hard times,
Yes,
they've
exactly.
kind of worked and sacrificed so much just to keep things going.
Yes.
That, you know, and actually that was what gave the organization the reputation that attracted the funding, by the way. They
Yeah.
feel that they're not benefiting
Yes.
because they're not being put in to run the special projects.
So that gets us back to one of these perennial change management goodies. And I mean that in an appreciative way, that if you do not, as an organization goes through significant change, if you do not make sure that the staff who've been there longer, if you do not avoid them feeling that everything they did so far is not that meaningful or no longer meaningful or useful, right? Then you are at risk of causing significant grief and grievance, right? And that's what you're also pointing out, though, from a particular angle. And the other thing that I was thinking, what you said in the beginning around change coming on top of business as usual, right? That's always, that's often very demanding. And NGOs and nonprofits, culturally speaking, can have a really difficult time of subtracting, of saying no, of stopping certain things, right? It's just such a pervasive cultural trait. So then, yeah, the risk of staff getting at least exhausted and or feeling that they as long-termers, long-timers are not that shiny compared to the new people is, I could imagine. Yeah. Anything else that comes to mind on that before we bring this to a close? I want to make sure you have one last opportunity to talk about the whole topic. Anything we haven't talked about?
Well, I mean, I think we've covered everything. I mean, I think I'm just left with sort of two catchphrases, if you will. Again, I've said this before, I'll come back to it again. Be careful what you wish for, right? Growth, funding is not a neutral thing. It's not necessarily advantageous because it's going to bring new challenges. Even for the healthiest, most, you know, well put together organization, it brings challenges. So there's that. Be careful what you wish for. And then secondly, my old phrase, you know, be a prepared organization, right? This proactive attention to these 6 areas that I've identified, and I'm sure there's others, but they are good for you no matter what. They position you to be clear about what are you doing and why are you doing it, how your people are coming along with you, how you are building capable people, how you are nurturing your culture, and all of those kind of things. Those suit you and serve you in every setting, whether you are growing, whether you are kind of at a steady state, right? Which for me is really about continual improvement, because you don't really stagnate. You may not be expanding numerically, but you can be continuing to improve your quality and bring in new ideas and things like that.
Yeah.
If you're having to do some kind of constricting, downsizing, you also want to be clear what's going to drive that. What are the criteria, the principles that we're going to use for making hard choices? So all of those things benefit by having done this proactive work that help you have a prepared, healthy organization that's nimble, flexible, ready to and able to deal with anything that they face.
Yeah. So in other words, irrespective of whether you will ever receive a big transformational gift, those are good things to pursue. Well, Michael, this was, I wanted to say a rich conversation, and there's no pun intended there. So if listeners want to learn more about your research on this topic, your knowledge base, your agency RCA's ability to help clients with change management needs, where should they go?
The 2 best places, I'm on LinkedIn as Michael Randel, and I post there regularly, and there's lots of resources and things there. And then our website, which is www.rca.org. changeadvisors.com.
Okay.
And we've got newsletters, we've got documents you can download, and blogs and podcasts that share lots of resources that can be helpful for you.
Yes.
And you can get in touch with us through either of those channels.
Okay, we will put all of that in the show notes. So thank you, Michael, for these insights. It was really interesting to think about. To think about organizational profiles that get big or bigger gifts, if you will, or otherwise that grow significantly. You gave us a lot of food for thought. And thank you, listeners, as well. If you found this podcast stimulating, then be sure to check out some of the other episodes in my podcast. There is another one with Michael on change management, number 80, as I said, and you will find all of these, not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5, but also my YouTube channel. I also want you to know about an interesting podcast called The Modern Humanitarian and Development Leader, with Tori Peace as a host. Tori and I are doing something new this early in this year. We're hosting a 2-part show together. So if you manage or lead in the development sector, you will find value in listening to her episodes on the modern humanitarian and development leader. Learn practical tips to empower diverse teams, take control of your time, and achieve more while doing less. And you will find the link to Tori's podcast, The Modern Humanitarian and Development Leader, in the show notes as well. Subscribe to my email list, so through my website as well, and you'll always be in the know about next interesting podcast or blog posts and other resources that are going to be dropped. With that, I am saying this was NGO Soul and Strategy. I wish you all a good 2025 as we head into the year, and see you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.